If you've been looking into buying a mini PC at all in the last 12 months, you're probably familiar with the name Beelink and specifically with the SER series. Now, Beelink has been making their SER series of mini PCs for a while now, but it's their SER5 series that has had the most amount of revisions that I have ever seen. Now, it really seems like Beelink loves to iterate, and every quarter they seem to launch a new series or revision of an already existing series. And the SER5 Mini P series has had such a wide variety of different systems. Now, you might be noticing that the trig key is here. And that's because I'm almost 99% sure this was made by the exact same OEM as Beelink systems, and it's just here to represent the Beelink SER5 with the Ryzen 5 5500U. Because the thing that we really need to talk about is just the wide variety of different chips that are all of these different systems. And we could really split these up into two categories. On the one hand, you do have the Ryzen 5 based systems where it ranges from anywhere from the Ryzen 5 5500U to the Ryzen 5 5560U, and there has even been a revision with the Ryzen 5 5600H, though this has been out of production for a little while now. But there are still models with that configuration available on both Amazon and AliExpress. But all of these systems come with Ryzen 6-core CPUs, though the architectures that they're based on will range anywhere between Zen 2 to Zen 3. And one of the biggest differentiating factors among all of these different systems is their TDP and the overall differentiations in terms of configuration of the hardware. One thing that I can say about Beelink is that they do go through a wide variety of different revisions of their hardware. Now, this can be a little annoying in the sense that you don't really know what you're going to end up getting a lot of the time, but they do actually make gradual improvements with each revision. So there is merit to getting whatever is the most recent thing that they have available. Now, the other category that we have here for the SER5 is the systems based on the Ryzen 7 5800H. There is both the Pro version of the SER5 and we now have the Max version. The difference between the two of them being some slight variations in the chassis, as well as the fact that we now have a TDP going all the way up to 54 watts. Now, if we get down and dirty with it all, the fact of the matter is that if you are just looking for a computer to use for your day-to-day tasks, any of these will do the job. And I do recommend going down the route of these systems instead of going for something cheaper. And I'll explain why. Windows is a lot more demanding now than it has ever been. And there are a lot of tasks that happen in Windows regularly now that end up using a lot more resources than you would expect. Specifically, the fact that Windows has its own built-in antivirus that likes to run on a regular schedule. Well, antivirus scans are actually extremely multi-threaded tasks. They're also very time-consuming based off of just how much stuff you have. All of these systems here have 6 cores and they all have SMT. So we're essentially getting double in terms of the threads. And all of this is really beneficial for all of those tasks that Windows is going to be doing in the background. You want those scans from the antivirus to finish as quickly as possible and to not affect what you're doing. Having all of these extra cores makes the overall experience of using these computers really, really nice. And you don't really save a lot of money going down for something cheaper in comparison to the amount of performance that you're sacrificing. Pretty much to save $50, you are sacrificing going down to 4-core CPUs that a lot of the times aren't even enabled to use SMT. So you're just left with 4 cores and an overall limited system just to save a few bucks here. Now, if you actually do have tasks that require some CPU performance, the versions with the 5800H, specifically the SER5 Max, are a very, very interesting proposition. Specifically because at this point right now, you can get this system for $320 and you're getting 8 cores that have a level of performance that is very comparable to the 6000 series from AMD, because there really wasn't much of an IPC gain going from the 5000 series to 6000 series on mobile, you pretty much get comparable performance CPU wise, the only disadvantage being the GPU. If that really doesn't matter to you, then it's a very compelling option. But let's actually look at the numbers before we actually come to a conclusion on what I recommend you go with. So comparing the CPUs amongst all of the different systems here, we're taking a look at Cinebench R23, and starting off at the bottom of the stack, we do have the Ryzen 5 5500U, giving us a multi-core score of 7,137, and that is with a TDP of 25 watts. Now this makes sense. This system is based off of Zen 2, which is a older architecture. Now the Ryzen 5 5560U ends up giving us a score of 7,566. This makes sense since this is based off of Zen 3, so the improvements in the architecture are going to become very apparent in the CPU, though its more limited cache and the fact that it is just capped at a 25 watt TDP do end up limiting it in comparison to the Ryzen 5 5600H, though this one is also pretty gimped in terms of TDP here, which is why we only end up getting a score of 8,002 for the multi-core performance. Now, this is something important to note, that the TDP actually greatly affects the performance of these chips. So just because something on paper might look like it should be dramatically better, the TDP is really going to dictate a lot of that performance. You might have realized that if you saw my recent video where I took a look at the SER5 Max versus the SER6, and the SRE5 Max was staying relatively competitive against a chip that had a overall better architecture for both its CPU and its GPU, and it really just came down to the fact that it had all of that extra wattage to work with. And that extra wattage becomes very apparent when we look at the 5800H on Cinebench here, where it ends up giving us a multi-core score of 11,848. That CPU really loved having access to all of that extra wattage. Now, as of the time of making this video, Beelink has just barely made available on their website a revision of this where, for one, they brought back the version with the 5560U. That was available sometime last year. It ended up getting discontinued specifically because that last batch that they did had a reset bug that pretty much meant that they were defective and people had to just get their money back for them. It seems like they're back now, and I would imagine that it's going to come with a bunch of quality of life improvements that have come with the different revisions of the SER5. But they are also coming out with a completely brand new SKU that is coming paired with a Ryzen 7 5700U. Now this is interesting because this is Zen 2, similar to the 5500U. That is going to be 8 cores of that. And if it starts to come down into the same price point where we've been seeing the 5500U and the 5600U systems, that's going to be very competitive in terms of CPU performance. But of course, I don't specifically have that SKU in front of me, so I can't tell you exactly how the performance is going to be like, but it's definitely one to keep an eye on. It's going to really live or die depending on the price point. But of course, one of the biggest differentiating factors of these systems in particular is their iGPUs, with a wide variety of different configurations available in this specific series. With on the bottom of the end, we actually have the 5560U having just a Radeon 6 iGPU. Now what that means is that it only has 6 Vega cores. Its maximum clock speed is reduced in comparison to all of the other systems. Now the 5500U and the 5600H both end up coming with the Radeon 7 iGPU, that is 7 Vega cores, and their maximum clock speed is 1800 megahertz, so a slight increase over what the Radeon 6 has. So we get a core bump as well as a clock speed jump there. And of course, if we go on to the 5800H and the 5700 5600U. We are looking at the Radeon 8 with, of course, a bump in the clock speed as well to go along with the increased core count. Now let's see what these iGPUs can actually do in terms of performance. So the first game that we're going to be taking a look at is Rainbow Six Siege, and here you can see it running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we are using FSR at the quality preset, and this is with the Vulkan API. Now in this specific title, there is a linear increase in terms of performance amongst all of the different models, but there does seem to be a cap that is hit once we reach the 5600H. So it's clear that the extra CPU and GPU performance of the Ryzen 7 5800H are just not of use in this specific system, and already moving up to a higher TDP chip like the 5600H gives us pretty much an identical level of performance. Now none of the chips here provide a bad gaming experience overall here, though there is a noticeable deficit between the 5560U and the 5800H. That being said though, the 5560U system is pretty much silent under load. And I think that that is one thing that becomes very apparent in all of this testing that you guys might not realize, is that because of the differences in TDP, all of these systems make vastly different noise. The 5560U and 5500U both produce very little to no noise most of the time, while the 5600 can get pretty audible and the 5800H is just an absolutely loud system. It makes sense, it has the highest TDP and it's going to have the most aggressive fan curve to keep that cool, and it does actually end up doing that. The temperatures that the system ends up hitting a lot of the times actually end up being even lower than most of the other systems, but it's just due to a very aggressive fan curve. And in a game like Cyberpunk, as you can see, it doesn't really push any of these systems to the point of making it actually playable in a game like Cyberpunk. That's why I threw this in here, because I wanted you to see what it would actually be capable of doing in comparison in modern games. And as you can see, even though there is a difference between the 5560U and the 5800H, it's not really enough to salvage a game like this. Now, if we actually take a look at a game that a system like this is really designed to play, then we start to see some pretty interesting numbers here. This is, of course, Counter-Strike Global Offensive running on these systems with its lowest in-game graphics settings. Though it should be noted that this, in comparison to the other tests, isn't going to be as accurate because of the fact that CSGO does not have a native built-in benchmark. So there is run-to-run variance, and that's why there was a 3-game average done for each system. But again, because of the lack of a built-in benchmark, it will make the numbers that we provide just inherently less accurate. That being said, though, we do see the linear trend, though actually in this case, the 5560U ended up performing an FPS average higher than the 5500U, though the 5500U did consistently have higher 1% lows. When we're talking about an FPS average that is above 100, a difference in 1% low of about 6 FPS isn't going to be as dramatic, except for the fact that the 1% lows are very consistently going under 60. So while we're able to hit some relatively decent averages, those 1% lows are a little troubling to see in what is supposed to be a competitive shooter. Now, it's not a deal breaker by any means, and more than likely, the average person playing CSGO is going to have a perfectly fine time on either of those systems. But if we take a look at the higher TDP chips, the 5600H and the 5800H both end up giving us some nice bumps in the FPS average, with the 5800H giving us a really nice increase here. And to go along with that, we do see some nice increases in the 1% lows. And at least with the higher TDP chips, the 1% lows do go up high enough that they are at least at 60 or above it. And it's really games like CSGO that show you what a chip like this is actually going to be capable of in the games that it's really meant to play. Not exactly designed to let you play Cyberpunk, but a game like CSGO or Valorant you can actually play on here, and these more expensive units with these higher end chips do actually give you some great levels of performance. But again, the biggest differentiator here is just the fact that the 5560U and 5500U systems are both just so much quieter than the other two. So if noise is very important to you, then I would keep an eye on the 5560U and the 5500U and see if the performance difference between the higher end systems is worth the sacrifice. Because if an absolutely silent system is really important to you, then it's these cheaper, lower wattage chips that you should be paying attention to. Because in the case of towards the bottom, we're talking about systems that end up utilizing pretty much less than half the power at the wall. We're not exactly looking at half of the performance. Now, continuing to look at these chips running in some older titles, here we have one that I very frequently like to take a look at, BioShock Infinite. I like to use it because it's a good indicator of what performance is going to be like in older titles from this era, and we do like to run this with the very high graphics preset. And here we get one of the most linear jumps in performance going through the different product stacks. So there is an improvement in overall performance as we move up, but none of them are able to give us a consistent above 60 FPS average, though the 5800H is the closest to that and will be almost indistinguishable for the vast majority of people. That being said, there is also a noticeable gap between the 5560U and 5500U, so that is important to keep in mind that the 5500U on paper is technically faster because it has the better iGPU, and in most games that's going to end up being better. But as we saw with CSGO, it isn't necessarily always going to be the case because the 5560U does have a better CPU. So to take a look at another test with a more mixed workload in terms of the GPU and the CPU, here we have Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord. And on all of the systems here, we continued this trend of linear increases in terms of our FPS average and 1% lows. Again, no system was able to give us a consistent 60 FPS average, but the 5800H is the closest to it, and for the vast majority of people, you won't really be able to tell much of a difference. Now, there is a meaningful gap between the 5800H and the 5600H, at least in terms of the FPS average, though 1% lows are a little closer to each other, while the 5500U and 5560U are relegated to being in essentially the 40s range, though the 5560U does actually have its 1% lows dip below 30, though just barely. In general, though, there is some noticeable differences in the performance amongst all these systems. Okay, so looking at those performance numbers, what do we conclude here? Which is the one to get? Which is the one that I recommend? Well, it really just comes down to it depends. There are a couple of scenarios where the option you go with changes. Now, part of it is just whenever you're actually seeing this, because of the fact that Beelink likes to do a lot of revisions, it really just depends on what is available at the market at the time for you. As of right now on Amazon, I can find models with the 5560U, which has also been brought back again. There are still a lot of models with the 5500U. You can even find some 5600Hs, those are far more rare. But I think that if you just want a day-to-day computer that you can just use without really needing to worry or even think about it, the 5560 and the 5500U are a very solid choice, especially because on sale you can usually find it in the lower $200 range. And at that price point, you pretty much get 6 cores, 12 threads, a GPU that is decent enough for some lighter titles. And the key thing is that it beats out pretty much anything else anywhere near that price point. Because if you try to save $40, you get down to around the $180 price range. You're looking at Intel N95s and Intel N100s, which are just 4-core CPUs, no hyperthreading, or you get into the territory of refurbished HP and Dell systems that all end up having 4 cores and 8 threads most of the time anyway, so it's still not as good as the 6 cores and 12 threads that you can get on these systems. Now, it might be Zen 2 or it might be Zen 3, but either way, the IPC difference between that and anything pre-Skylake is just going to be pretty noticeable to the point where there's no point in saving those $40. Now, for around $320 right now, you can get the SER5 Max, and that is the 5800H with a TDP of 54 watts. Now, if you're looking for maximum performance, but the CPU is the most important thing and not necessarily as much the GPU, this is a perfect buy at $320 because that is 8 cores that have an IPC that is almost identical to the 6800H and the 7735HS, which are the same chips. But because of the fact that Ryzen 6000 series series didn't really get much of an IPC uplift at all, the CPU difference between the two of them is actually not really that drastic at all. We're talking about single-digit performance differences. So it's essentially getting a system with the same CPU performance as anything with a 7735HS, but for only $320, as opposed to the over $400 for any system with the 7735HS. Now you do have the option of also just going with the normal SER5 Pro that has the same 5800H with a lower TDP if noise is more important to you, but you still want to have those 8 cores. You are going to be giving up a little bit in terms of your multi-core performance, and really it is going to affect some of your gaming performance in terms of 1% lows and things like that, but you get an overall quieter system, and that might be more worthwhile for you. It's essentially a balancing act on just how much noise you're willing to put up with. Now, one thing that I do want to point out is that these systems are really great if you're looking at setting up a Proxmox cluster. 6 cores, 12 threads, 500 to a terabyte of storage depending on the specific models that you decide to go with. But you get all of that from anywhere between $200 to $320. You go $320, that gets you an 8-core system with a terabyte of storage. That means that for around $1,000, you can get a 3-node cluster with each node having 8 cores, 16 threads, 16 terabytes, or if you're willing to spend a little bit more, you can have up to 32 gigabytes of RAM on all of them, and you get that terabyte of storage on each individual node. That actually ends up looking like a pretty crazy setup where we're at a price point where people will start to just buy decommissioned servers, but at that point they only have one singular node. So if you've ever had any interest at all at essentially creating a Kubernetes cluster, a Proxmox cluster, and get into a high availability orchestration and things like that, these are actually really great solutions, because if you go down the 6-core route, then that's 3 6-core 12-thread nodes that you can get for around $600 to $700. So there is a lot of value to be had with these little systems. That's why I really enjoy them a lot. So definitely something to consider there when you're looking at these options. And at that point, the lower TDP versions of the 5800H actually end up looking like really great deals, because those lately have been going on sale for as low as $300, some of them even going down to around $280 to $290. And at those price points with those lower TDPs, they make great home lab setups, where again, for less than $1,000, you can get yourself a 3-node cluster of these things, and you're gonna get far more cores than most decommissioned optiplexes and even servers out there. And not to mention, they are very, very efficient at the wall. So really, my recommendation to you is that if you need just an everyday computer, the Ryzen 5s are absolutely perfect, and you will never have to touch that computer again for probably the next decade, unless there is some kind of fault in the hardware itself. While if you want performance, the Max version presents an excellent value proposition right now, though it is further up into the territory where you might consider maybe spending another $150 and getting yourself the 7735HS version of the SRE6 Pro. But at that point, that is a pretty massive leap in cost for essentially just a GPU upgrade, because again, the CPU is going to perform practically identically to this. So CPU is the thing that matters the most. The SER5 Max is just a crazy value. The dark horse of all of this is also the fact that we do have the version with the 5700U coming out very soon. And if this could come down into the price point of the systems like the 5500U and the 5560U, then that becomes a crazy value for any home labbers out there, because then at that point you're able to set up a 3-node cluster for around $700, and each of those nodes 8 cores, 16 gigabytes or 32 gigabytes, and you can even upgrade those to over a terabyte of storage each. And at RAM prices right now and storage prices, this isn't even that crazy of an idea. You're not suddenly starting to spend multiple thousands of dollars. It's a very viable option, so definitely keep an eye on that. I'm going to be seeing about potentially trying to get my hands on one of those just to actually get some numbers there. But so far, I have been greatly impressed with this entire series of systems. But anyways, I will catch you guys in the next one.